Okay, so the very last section in this lecture is going to be interventions for sexual assault. So what do we need to do if a patient discloses they've been sexually assaulted? Maybe they are coming in to report that assault, or they've come in for something else and they report that incidentally. We want to create a safe environment. So as the nurse, your job is to advocate for the patient. So your job is to make that environment as safe as possible for that patient. You want to take a really careful history, try to take your time and give the patient time to get to tell you what's happened. If the patient consents to a forensic exam, that needs to be done as soon as possible. It should be done by a trained, sane nurse whenever possible, sexual assault nurse examiner. That nurse is trained to gather evidence, is available as an expert witness, and coordinates aftercare. Clothing should be bagged. All stains and secretions should be swabbed and labeled. Hair and fingernail samples are clipped. Usually, if any hairs or there's any debris on the patient or their clothing, that's labeled. Blood samples are taken. Photos of the injuries are taken, and any areas of the body that were affected are swabbed as applicable. This exam needs to be done very carefully. It tends to take some time if done right, because this patient's just been traumatized and now we're doing an invasive exam. So all procedures need to be explained before they're done and permission received for every individual piece of this. We also, as the nurse, we want to provide emergency care, give a physical exam, treat apparent injuries. Patients who have been sexually assaulted and have been potentially exposed to either STIs, HIV, bloodborne illnesses, or pregnancy should be offered preventives for that. So STI prophylaxis is standard. HIV prophylaxis is offered based on risk assessment. They may receive follow-up, or if the risk is higher, they may receive meds, because those meds have a little bit of risk attached. An emergency contraception should be offered. The nurse acts as the patient's advocate. Your role in the entire situation is the patient advocate. Family and friends may react different ways. They may be very angry. They may try to go out and harm the assailant, or they may blame the survivor or be angry that they weren't more careful. They may see the assault as sexual rather than aggressive. They may treat the survivor as unclean or of lesser value. They may seek revenge. Families also often need to be referred for counseling. And in particular, partners may need to be referred for counseling to deal with their own emotional response to this assault. Prosecution. The survivor chooses whether to report and press charges. This also seems like it would be a no-brainer. We're going to automatically do that. But the survivor should be able to choose whether to report and press charges. There are times when an assault is reported and the DA may decline to press charges. The prosecution may feel like a second assault. The defense attorney usually focuses on the survivor's behavior and tries to prove that the survivor was not raped, or that it was not the perpetrator. But it typically focuses on the survivor's behavior. The publicity may be humiliating. People who have been assaulted may be afraid of retaliation if they're assaulted, or if they report, if they press charges. So I'm going to show you a graph, a visual of this. But only about 6 out of every 1,000 rapists ever spend any time in prison. So for a lot of people, it may not be worth the trauma of prosecution for that low a chance. So I'm going to pull up a chart that shows a graph of this. So let me share the screen. Out of every 1,000 rapes, 310 are reported to the police. So most rapes are actually not even reported. Out of those 310, about 57 reports lead to an arrest. So about 57 rapists are arrested out of 1,000 rapes. 11 cases actually get referred to prosecutors. 7 cases lead to conviction, and 6 rapists will be incarcerated out of 1,000. So the prosecution, the conviction, the jail rates are pretty, or prison rates are pretty devastating. And a lot of people who have been assaulted actually choose not to prosecute for that reason. I want to talk for a second about victim blaming. Because it's really common in our culture. We tend to always want to try to find out the reason something happened to another person. I think that that's a little bit of a defense mechanism, because if something terrible happens to another person, if I can figure out a way that it was their fault, then maybe it won't happen to me. If something bad happened to them because of something they did, then maybe it won't happen to me. So it gives us this illusion of control over what happens to us. But it is very, very harmful to victims, and it actually increases our own risk also. So victim blaming makes people less likely to report. That's why only 371 of those are reported. It minimizes the risk and the damage done. So it makes people think they're overreacting to feel very strongly about what happened to them. A lot of victims actually internalize those statements. They actually will begin to convince themselves, well, if I hadn't been there, it wouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have gone to his house. I shouldn't have gone to the bar by myself. I shouldn't have had too much to drink. But the real problem is that victim blaming places responsibility on the abused for the actions of the abuser. So it doesn't do anything to decrease the abuse. It just makes the abuser less likely to be able to recover. What does victim blaming look like? It looks like, what were they wearing? Why were they out that late? Why were they alone? Why did they go to his room? Why did they accept the date? Why did they order something expensive? Victim blaming starts to look for the reason in the victim's behavior. And it's really essential that we counter that. And we probably need to counter that in ourselves first, because that's so embedded in our culture that most of us have some of those thought processes whenever something bad happens to another person. Okay, that's going to be it for this lecture. It was a heavy one, and but that's also going to be it for me for this unit. So I will see you in class.